I want to thank Jim Hill and other organizers of this meeting for the opportunity to speak to you today about a topic that's been of great interest to me for at least the past several decades. And it can be summarized in many ways by this representation of the classical Cartesian concern with regard to the relationship of the mind and the body. And I think ultimately the issue of weight regain in individuals otherwise successfully reduced can be represented in this way, in the sense that it is a circumstance in which the mind clearly wishes one thing, but the body is unable to comply. And summary of the situation is shown in this slide, which is one of many from which I could have selected, showing that the recidivism to obesity in individuals who are successfully weight reduced, substantially weight reduced, here by very low calorie diets and very low calorie diets plus behavioral therapy or behavior modification, are successful in losing weight, but over a period of several years largely regain that weight. This is a bit pessimistic. It's from the mid-1990s, and I think more recent data would suggest, for example, the Haynes data up to 2006, that perhaps as many as 15 or 20% of individuals can successfully sustain a 10% or more weight loss, but do so as a result of very assiduous attention to both physical activity and more particularly energy intake, as you will see. We've studied this situation in great detail in human subjects who've been admitted to a clinical research center, fed liquid formula diets to titrate their intake and body weight to absolute constancy over a period of 4 to 6 weeks, which is shown here as weight initial. And then we've dropped their weight by 10% by feeding them about 800 calories of this liquid formula diet, and then restabilized their weight 10% below initial, again with the liquid formula diet, and looked at their physiology at these two time points in a number of very relevant ways, meaning we've looked at their energy expenditure, their intake, and characterized neuroendocrine axes, autonomic physiology, their muscle physiology, and actually done brain imaging. And I will show you data from these studies in a moment. It's also important to emphasize here that we've done these studies on both lean individuals who've never been obese and on individuals who are substantially obese and have been that way for most of their adult lives. Here's a schematic representation of the data obtained by that sequential study of individuals at usual and reduced body weight, showing that, rather surprisingly at the time, obese and lean individuals plot on the same regression line. That is, it's not true that obese individuals maintaining usual body weight require less calories in proportion to their metabolic mass as individuals who are lean or never obese. So here we see the regression line relating energy expenditure to lean body mass in these individuals. And the question is, what happens when they are experimentally weight reduced by, in this case, 10%? Do they simply slide down this regression line and have energy expenditure at this reduced metabolic mass that's predictable by this initial relationship of energy expenditure to metabolic mass? Or does something else happen? And in fact, something else does happen. They actually fall off the regression line so that they now require, at that reduced weight, 10 or 15 to 20% less than you would have predicted from their requirements at usual body weight. And in the data that I will show you, we often refer to this difference as the residual between the actual energy expenditure requirement, and that would be predicted by the individual's energy requirements at usual body weight. Our group is not the only ones to see this decline in energy expenditure relative to metabolic mass in weight-reduced individuals. Here's a study done by Kevin Hall and his group at the NIH, and probably well known to many of you as the Biggest Loser television program. Here are individuals at their usual body weights. These are individuals of varying degrees of adiposity. Here, more extreme obesity than down here. Here's the regression line, same as the one that we saw in our studies. And the question now is what happens to these individuals when they lose weight? And here you can see the result in the open circles that, like the subjects that we studied, Kevin's also show a 15 or 20% decline in energy expenditure relative to metabolic mass. Shortly after the discovery of the hormone leptin, we did these studies measuring the levels of the hormone relative to fat mass in lean here and obese subjects of both genders. Females were shown to have lower levels than males, and it turns out that's due to the preponderance of subcutaneous adipose tissue in females, which actually produces less leptin than intra-abdominal fat cells. But more importantly, at least at this point in this case, is the fact that obese individuals are not deficient in leptin, as was hypothesized, at least at the time. Lack of leptin is not the mechanism for the vast majority of individuals who are obese. They're actually producing higher levels of leptin in the circulation than non-obese individuals. So leptin is produced by adipose tissue in proportion to its mass and the number of fat cells in the body, shown by the two vertical arrows here. And the leptin, as many of you are aware, produces a signal within the central nervous system, acting both at the level of the hypothalamus and the brainstem to have profound effects on both energy intake and expenditure. In this way, the leptin provides a signal to the brain with regard to the sufficiency or functional capacity of adipose stores. And in weight-reduced individuals, based on this kind of schematic, what's going on is that they are reducing, therapeutically in this case, their fat mass, and that the physiological consequences are seen as a result of the reduction in fat mass, and hence the signaling into these centers in the central nervous system that control both food intake and energy expenditure. Another representation of this idea, or an extension of it, is the following. Here is an individual with a larger amount of fat mass, here an individual with a smaller amount of fat mass. And here what I'm showing you is that one of the models that we use is that within the central nervous system, a set of genes, cell types, and other metabolic influences set what we call a threshold. Some people refer to this as a set point for the sufficiency of leptin signaling. So this individual who has more fat cells actually needs those fat cells to get over his or her higher signaling threshold within the central nervous system. And this individual with a lower threshold actually requires less leptin to be sufficient, at least with regard to signaling in the central nervous system. And that when an individual is reduced in body weight, such as this individual going to this lower fat mass, the signal is reduced, but the threshold is not. So individuals losing weight reduce the signal, but not the set point, so to speak. And so we'll reach a point at which the signal is insufficient to the central nervous system's expectations, if you will, with regard to the intensity of the signal with regard to adipose tissue mass. And hence this individual going to the reduced state of fat mass, actually his or her central nervous system detects this as a state of inadequate supply of body fat and as a threat actually to survival and reproductive capacity. Food restriction, similar to weight reduction but occurring much more rapidly, reduces the amount of leptin produced by adipose tissue. And here you'll see the results of an experiment that we did in rats in which we measured levels in the hypothalamus of two of the neuropeptides that stimulate food intake, NPY and AGRP, and one that suppresses food intake by virtue of producing alpha MSH, which interacts with the melanocortin-4 receptor. So here are the animals in the fed state with regard to the level of these peptides in the hypothalamus, and here in the black bars you see the elevation of the hunger neuropeptides, if you will, in the fasted animal, and a reduction of the satiety peptide, if you will, in the fasted animals. Then what we did is actually gave low doses of leptin to these rats, even though they were still fasted, and showed that the level of the hunger hormones or neuropeptides in the brain comes down and the level of the satiety peptide goes back up. Again, consistent with this idea that leptin is sending a signal to the central nervous system with regard to the sufficiency of stored calories, and the central nervous system is responding in a direction that would increase food intake, obviously, during the fasted state. And the leptin actually restores the neuroendocrine changes in the brain, even though the animals are still in the fasted state. So now I want to show you an experiment which in a sense recapitulates that rat experiment, but done in the human subjects that I described to you earlier. So here is the initial protocol producing a 10% reduction in body weight in individuals who are in an inpatient setting under very tight control. Here are the studies that I'm going to show you the results of in a moment. And then what we did to those individuals is gave them very low doses of leptin, sufficient in magnitude to raise the level of leptin in their circulation back to where it was before they had lost weight. So what we're trying to do now is see whether the restoration of circulating leptin in these individuals can, in that sense, trick the central nervous system into thinking that the body fat has not been lost. Again, confirming or supporting the idea that leptin is the mechanism or a primary mechanism for sending to the central nervous system this signal of insufficiency, if you will, of calorie stores relative to that threshold in the individual. So let me show you some of the studies and their results with regard to the leptin replacement. So this slide summarizes effects on both energy expenditure and energy intake in weight-reduced human subjects. And I showed you schematically the data, or some of the data on the left, showing you that as individuals go down in body weight, minus 10%, minus 20%, there's a decline in energy expenditure adjusted for metabolic mass. The major decline occurs in the first 10% of weight loss, but there's a little bit of an additional adjustment or compensation, if you will, in the 20% reduced individuals. And the major compartment of this change is actually in the non-resting energy expenditure, shown in red. Resting metabolic rate declines a bit, but the major change is in the energy cost of low levels of physical activity. We'll come back to this in a moment. And here is the energy intake side in studies done by Harry Kiselev, one of our collaborators, showing that in individuals at weight initial compared to themselves at weight minus 10%, they have less of a sensation of fullness and of how much they've eaten, both before and after a meal. In other words, they have trouble clocking or gauging the amount that they have eaten and tend to underestimate the amount that's eaten and how full they feel. Again, suggesting that the hunger drive is increased by the loss in body weight and the energy expenditure reduced. And this we refer to sometimes as a perfect storm. The energy expenditure is down and the drive to eat is increased. Here are some of these data, some additional data with regard to the phenotype of these individuals, showing that in the 10% weight reduced state, the sympathetic nervous system is tuned down and the parasympathetic nervous system is tuned up. And many of you will recall that the sympathetic nervous system is a critical player in terms of mediating rates of energy expenditure. For example, the thyroid axis is tuned down in weight-reduced individuals so that T3 and T4 are down. TSH, the central hormone that drives this, is reduced in the weight-reduced individual. This is percent change from these individuals at their usual body weight. They're not in the level of what one would consider clinical hypothyroidism, but the thyroid axis is tuned down, as is the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. And when we study these people using a bicycle ergometer, meaning we put them on a bike with a mask and measure their rates of oxygen consumption at very low levels of output, here measured in watts, at 10 or 25 watts, these individuals at reduced weight are actually more efficient in terms of generating 25 watts compared to themselves when they were at their usual body weight. This means, if you will, that they are getting more miles per gallon from their skeletal muscle in terms of its contractile efficiency. This effect actually is gone at higher levels of muscle work, here shown at 50 watts. An important question, of course, is whether or not these accommodations, if you will, of energy expenditure and hunger in reciprocal directions that tend to drive weight regain persist over time. And in the panel here on the left, one can see total energy expenditure versus fat-free mass, here in individuals at their usual weight, here in individuals shown in the blue squares recently weight reduced, like the studies that I just showed you and the studies of Hall. And here in the red open squares, these individuals sustaining weight loss for periods of up to 6 years. So you can see that the energy accommodation or adjustment, if you will, persists more or less indefinitely in individuals who are successful in keeping their weight reduced. And here is a study of hunger ratings in individuals following a meal, showing that individuals at their initial body weight show a decline in hunger with a meal, that gradually the degree of hunger recovers over a period of 250 minutes. But individuals who are either recently or 6-year weight reduced show less reduction in hunger with a meal. And this phenotype persists, as indicated here, for periods of up to 6 years in these individuals. So these adjustments are not transient. They actually are permanent stigmata, if you will, of the successful loss of body weight, which has obvious implications with regard to the long-term management of these individuals. I want to make it clear that there is variability among individuals in terms of their response to a 10% weight reduction. And you can see it here. This is the zero change from, say, usual weight to minus 10%. And you can see most people do show the decline that I mentioned to you, and that the mean is around 340 kilocalories per day, below what would be predicted from their usual weight. But the there's a great deal of variability among individuals in the degree of this adjustment, which may relate to aspects of what I referred to as the threshold or set point, or other aspects of this physiology that we don't at this point fully understand. Here is, again, a follow-up 6 years follow-up study in Hall's Biggest Loser study. And again, at 6 years, you can see persistence of the reduction in body weight in these individuals, even 6 years after achieving rather high levels of weight reduction. Again, confirming the idea that these adjustments, if you will, are not transient. Here I want to emphasize a point undoubtedly well known to many of you, that the circuits within the central nervous system that regulate energy intake are clearly very complex, not fully understood, but can be divided, if you will, into two major sort of canonical categories. One we often refer to as the homeostatic factors, which is what I've been talking to you about primarily here, which is signals of adiposity coming into the region of the hypothalamus and the brainstem that influence aspects of regulatory food intake, if you will, in response to what the central nervous system is evolved to detect as a threat to survival or reproduction as a result of reduction in stored energy. But there are also these non-homeostatic or hedonic factors that regulate intake, such as emotions and mood and items or habits that have been learned in the past, stress, and many other factors that are controlled by what are often referred to as higher regions of the central nervous system. And both of these obviously interact in very complex ways to determine ultimately how an individual will respond to a reduction in stored calories as a result of a therapeutic weight reduction. And we've actually looked at this to some extent by doing functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain of the individuals that I described to you earlier in our studies of 10% weight reduction, and it's schematized here. So what I'm showing you is fMRI signals from the brains of individuals at usual body weight, at 10% weight loss, and after receiving replacement doses of leptin. These are periods of about 6 weeks each. And what we've done is to show these individuals in these various weight states, either food items or non-food items. This is obviously a food item, and have scored, if you will, quantitatively the response of different areas of the central nervous system in response to food in weight-reduced or usual body weight states. And again, this is a very complex data set. You can read about it if you wish. Much of this is published, but just to summarize, we've seen decreases in signal intensity in the hypothalamus, the amygdala, the cingulate. These are examples of regions that are important, again, as you know, in both regulatory or homeostatic and these hedonic controls of food intake, increased in the brainstem, striatum, and other parts of the central nervous system with weight reduction. As I'll come to in a moment, this leptin replacement abolishes almost all of these changes. And here you can see a summary of what we've seen in the physiology of the weight-reduced state, some of which I've described to you. So in terms of energy expenditure, a reduction of 300 or 400 kilocalories per day below what would be predicted from the new body size and composition of the individual, a reduction in the cost of muscle energy expenditure to do low levels of physical activity, reduced satiation, reduced perception of calories ingested, and in the neuroimaging, increase in the regions of reward and motivation, reduction in areas of self-control and hypothalamus. as I mentioned, the sympathetic autonomic nervous system is tuned down. The neuroendocrine system is tuned down in a way that I showed you with regard to thyroid hormone. And as I alluded to, but haven't shown you the data, the contractile efficiency of muscle is increased by about 15 or 20% as a result of changes in myosin heavy chain isotype expression and changes in glucose utilization and increases in free fatty acid oxidation. It's important to note that, as I alluded to, virtually all of these are reversed by the exhibition of these low levels of leptin that I described to you earlier. Again, consistent with the ideas leptin is playing a critical role in mediating this accommodation, if you will, to the weight-reduced state. The data that I showed you earlier with regard to the persistence of these phenotypes suggests that in this regard, the threshold is not changeable, so that in individuals who have undergone prolonged weight reduction, the threshold does not drop in order to accommodate their lower body weight, but continues in the location physiologically that it was and continues to drive this signaling, if you will, of insufficiency of stored calories. There are certainly other ways in which the threshold or set point can be changed, but in weight reduction, this is not the case. So I want to end by emphasizing what's probably pretty obvious at this point, that there is a very strong effect of weight loss on energy homeostatic systems, producing a hypometabolic and hungry state. And that in this sense, weight reduction actually induces a non-physiological state. That is, the individual is chronically hypometabolic and hungry relative to themselves in their usual body weight circumstance, be they lean or obese. And that what we should be emphasizing, at least to some extent, in our efforts to understand and help individuals to sustain long-term weight reduction, which would have an enormous impact on the obesity problem from a therapeutic perspective, is restoring normal physiology in individuals who are nonetheless weight reduced. And I've shown you evidence that leptin at least has the ability to do this. As a model, not necessarily as a therapeutic intervention, although it's a reasonable possibility. Here is an example of this strategy in which we deployed a small peptide, melanocortin-4 receptor agonist. And as you know, engagement of the agonism at the melanocortin-4 receptor reduces food intake. So here we're giving the drug at a dose sufficient to get weight reduction in these animals and sustain it over a period of time. This is about 80 days. And here in another group of animals in whom we pre-reduced the animals. So this would be the equivalent of a weight-reduced individual. Now in the dark blue broken line here, I'm showing you the dose required to at least partially sustain weight loss equivalent to that of the animals that were weight reduced with the compound to begin with. And the dose required to induce weight loss in these animals was about 50 nanomoles per day, and the dose required to sustain modest weight reduction in these animals was 1/5 of that, 10 nanomoles per day. So what I'm trying to do here is simply to make the argument that the strategy of using drugs that are useful in weight reduction may also be useful in terms of sustaining reduced body weight, and by virtue of the altered physiology will require much lower doses of drugs that are otherwise efficacious in weight reduction per se. So before I close, I just want to identify many of the people who did much of the work that I reported. Mike Rosenbaum, who's been a long-standing collaborator in this work. Jules Hirsch, of course, over many years. Rochelle Goldsmith did the muscle physiology, or some of the muscle physiology that I mentioned. Wahida Karmali is a dietitian, nutritionist who helped us with the weight perturbation studies in the humans that I mentioned. Dr. Skoronsky did the study that I showed you of the melanocortin 4 agonist, and Lou Aroni and Martika Heener have been collaborators over many years in the muscle studies that I alluded to in part. Here are Martika Heener and Lou Aroni. I want to thank you for your attention and indicate that if you have patients in whom you suspect a genetic etiology for their obesity or diabetes for that matter, please feel free to contact me at the email address given on this slide, and we'd be happy to help in terms of evaluating such individuals. Thanks again.